Welcome back to True Crime Sundays. It's been like 3 years. I wanted to return to the true crime community with an Australian case. This is the case of Richard Dorrough. I don't care to get his name pronunciation right, and you'll find out why soon. Richard was a 37-year-old man and he worked as a driver in Perth. He had 3 kids at the time and he confessed to murdering 3 people in a shocking discovery before he took his own life. Richard had organised for a parcel to be sent to his then fiancée, where she would find a couple of his belongings and among those a book. And in the book, as she was flipping through the pages, she would find a page with a confession of, "I did kill 3 times. And in a lot of the articles that I found on this case, Richard was described as leading a double life, with those who knew him describing him as polite and charming, and they talk about all of his achievements as a Navy SEAL, and they note heartwarming quotes about Richard just not having the courage to discuss the murders while he was alive. But none of this is true, and I'll get into that very shortly. The first woman that he was suspected of killing is a woman named Sarah Lee Davey. She was only 21 years old and she was a First Nations woman from Broome. What you might notice about all of these suspected victims is that they're all Indigenous women. Now, as I mentioned, Richard was in the Navy. However, he did consistently get less than favourable evaluations from Navy supervisors, and he would later be discharged from the Navy due to him being incompetent. On the night that Sarah went missing, Richard was allowed an onshore leave according to Perth Now News, and this is where they met. Sarah was out with friends on the morning of January 13th of 1997, where Richard worked to convince her to separate from her friends and to come with him. Sarah, being charmed by Richard, ended up leaving the Nippon Inn and going off with him. He did try to bring Sarah back to the Navy ship, but the Navy seamen who were guarding the ship stopped the pair from boarding. Now, it's unknown whether the pair wanted to go back to the ship just to hang out or perhaps to do more. What we do know is that after being denied entry onto the ship, Richard led Sarah to the end of the wharf. A nearby fisherman would later report hearing screams of a woman and splashing. A few minutes later, Richard returned to dock his ship and Navy personnel reported scratches on his face. Sarah would never be seen or heard from again. Now, a moment of personal speculation as to the motive. Could it have been that Richard wanted to do something with Sarah, but maybe he was rejected due to them not having privacy? Or perhaps moves were made and Sarah only wanted to hang out with him? Was it rejection that caused Richard to do what he was alleged of doing? Or could it have been that maybe when they were rejected from boarding the ship that Richard became enraged and took it out on Sarah? 3 days after that fateful night, Sarah's mother, Irene, returned from her trip. After countless attempts to get a hold of her daughter with no answer, Irene contacted the police to file a missing persons report. Sarah's family reported that they felt dismissed by everyone, hoping that the law would bring justice, but unfortunately nothing ever came from it. Irene went to the police station pleading for help every single morning for the span of a whole month, but police did not take her seriously. It took Broome police 9 days to even start looking into the disappearance, but by that time, Richard and his ship and any evidence that could have been collected had long departed Broome. They also failed to interview Sarah's friends from the night that she disappeared, which Perth Now News correctly notes that doing this could have led police directly to Richard, and they could have collected the clothes that he was wearing that night. Now, I also wonder if police had acted with due diligence and perhaps a little more quickly than what they did, maybe they could have caught him with the scratches on his face. It actually took Broome police 3 whole months just to interview Richard, but they wrote it off as inconclusive. Sarah's mum pleaded with the media, the police, she appealed to the public on television, but nothing ever eventuated from her efforts. Now, in my opinion, this reads as weaponized incompetence on the side of Broome police. Now, I think all of us can use our critical thinking skills here to surmise that if Sarah had been a white girl, the police, the media, the public, public, everyone would have shut that town down and Richard would have been charged. And I can guarantee you that Australia would have stopped as a nation if Irene was a white woman pleading for the return of her white daughter. And we see this time and time again. Richard's second alleged victim was Rachel Campbell, who was murdered 1 year after Sarah's disappearance. Now, Rachel was Indigenous to Aotearoa. She was a Māori woman and a single mother who was living in Sydney at the time. She was only 29 years old, so that's my age. She was exactly my age when this happened to her. Rachel was an S worker who was said to carry a pocket knife for protection while she worked. Rachel was found a short 3 kilometers away from Richard's house. She was wrapped up in a sheet, naked, and she had wounds to the neck, but she also had bite marks. Remember this. Rachel was seen getting into an orange van on the night that she was murdered, and not only did Richards own an orange van at the time, but when the case was finally entered into the police DNA database 10 years later, Richard's DNA was a match. But why did it take police 10 years to match this DNA? Rachel's mother had made police reports, but again, the police were far too slow to act on it. And by this time, Richard had been discharged from the Navy due to incompetence. And when police came to collect DNA swabs, he anxiously confessed to murdering someone in Sydney when he was confiding to his partner at the time. Richard's DNA swabs did come back as a match, and police arrested him at the home that he was sharing with his brother-in-law, Stuart. Police failed to collect evidence from this case. Stuart later reported that when Richard was arrested, he went into his room and found his laptop, which was filled with tabs and tabs of pornography. Richard did stand trial for the murder of Rachel, but the state and the police failed to call witnesses that were relevant to the case, like Richard's partner, who he had verbally confessed to, or Richard's brother-in-law, Stuart, who reported that no one even collected evidence. Although the DNA from the scene did match Richard, the state and the police, who failed to adequately prepare for the trial, meant that jurors found Richard not guilty. But the judge on the trial later commented that if it was up to him, he would have found Richard guilty, and that he was shocked by the jurors' decision. The last suspected victim was another Indigenous woman. Her name was Paula Brown, and Paula was a Sydney hairdresser who owned a salon across from the pub that the Navy SEALs frequented at the time. Paula was actually murdered 1 year before Sarah disappeared. Paula was found on Sydney's Oxford Street with blunt force trauma to the head and bite marks, similar to Rachel's case. Little is known as to whether the police have let this case go cold, but there has been no justice to the family or for the families of any of these cases. Now, it makes me wonder, if police did put any effort into investigating Sarah's case, they may have been able to retrieve her body. And if they did, would they have found bite marks? The same bite marks that were found on both Rachel and Paula's bodies. If the state called Richard's girlfriend as a witness, would his verbal confession of the killing and the DNA that matched him have changed the jury's mind? It also makes me wonder if the police swabbed the bite marks on any of these cases. Could these bite marks have been linked through DNA swabs? Did they take any pictures of any of the bite marks and match it to dental records from Richard? Or did they do what they have historically done with all 3 cases and failed to link these cases through evidence? Could there be more Indigenous women that fell victim to Richard that we just don't know about? Or was the diary confession true, that he did only kill 3 times? These slayings happened once every year for 3 years, so could there be more? They say that people always confess their darkest secrets before death, so why did Richard choose to take his own life? After all of these years, why then? Indigenous women are met with different advocacy in death and disappearance than white women do. We've already spoken about how this impacts the police investigation, but this also affects how media tell their stories. Why is it that the media continue to tell stories and start stories and headline stories with the killer's accolades and their supposed demeanors when they're hardly true? In these articles, he was described as polite and charming. Had Richard been a black or brown killer, he may have been described as porn-addicted creep who targets and kills and bites Indigenous women, who was described by supervisors as being incompetent and less than favorable. In none of these articles did we learn about the black and brown victims, their lives, their achievements, or how polite, how charming they were. We only heard Richard's made-up story.